us discuss the question number 1b from IES 2023 Economics Paper 3. Right? Now the question in front of you reads, how is the incidence of a commodity tax related to the elasticity of demand and supply curve? सबसे पहले हम लोग इंसिडेंस के बारे में पढ़ लेते हैं. इंसिडेंस ऑफ ए कमोडिटी टैक्स का मतलब है कि बर्डन ऑफ टैक्सेशन शेयर्ड बाय कंज्यूमर्स एंड sellers, right? Buyers and sellers. Now it depends on the elasticity of demand and supply. तो कैसे याद रखेंगे? अगर इनइलास्टिसिटी ज्यादा है, जिसके पार्ट पे इनइलास्टिसिटी ज्यादा है, that party will bear the burden of taxation more than the other. Means if demand is inelastic, then the buyers will have to bear the burden of taxation than sellers. If sellers are inelastic, then the seller will have to bear the burden of taxation. So burden of taxation falls on inelasticity. यानी कि जो inelastic ज्यादा होगा, यानी कि less responsive to price change. तो जो less responsive होंगे price change से, तो tax की वजह से price change होगा, तो वहां पे ज्यादा changes नहीं आएगा and easily price can be changed. यानी कि अगर हम लोग एग्जाम्पल है डिमांड का, तो मान लीजिए डिमांड इज परफेक्टली इलास्टिक सपोज और रिलेटिवली इनइलास्टिक, ठीक है, फॉर सर्टेन कमोडिटीज. यानी कि अगर प्राइस इंक्रीज होगा तो डिमांड उतना फॉल नहीं होगा, राइट, बिकॉज द डिमांड इज इनइलास्टिक. तो ऐसे में प्राइस को इजीली इंक्रीज कर सकते हैं. तो सेलर्स क्या कर सकते हैं कि जो टैक्स का शेयर है वो बायर्स पे अगर डाल देंगे, तो बायर्स विल स्टिल कंटिन्यू टू बाय द कमोडिटी because their responsiveness to the price change is less, and that is why the demand is inelastic, and they will end up bearing larger share of tax. So that is why whether it is demand or supply, whichever is more inelastic will have to share the burden of taxation more than the other party. So let us have a look at the figure here. So number panel 1 here, it is very clear that the supply curve is elastic, relatively elastic, whereas the demand curve is less elastic than that. So of course here it is shown that, as you can see, that the tax burden will here lie on the buyers. Why? Because supply is elastic, demand is less elastic, so comparatively demand is inelastic. So if the price increases, the demand will fall less, it will be less responsive, so the tax share will be on the buyers. Now in this case, as you can see, demand is more elastic and the supply is relatively less elastic. That means here the supply will be less affected with respect to change in price. So that is why on the supply side there will be change in price and the tax burden will be shared by sellers more than the buyers. Next is panel C here. Panel C is again relatively elastic demand. Sellers bear most of the burden here. And in this case again, relatively inelastic demand, so buyers bear the most of the demand. So in the first two panel, we have shown elastic supply and inelastic supply. So in panel A, with elastic supply, burden is more on the buyers. With inelastic supply, burden is more on the sellers. In panel C, the demand is elastic, so burden is more on the sellers. And in panel D, demand is inelastic, so the burden is more on the buyers. So depending on the degree of elasticity, we can say that the burden of taxation is shared by which party more than the other one. Clear? Now, let us quickly look at the summary then. So here it is said, if we talk about the demand curve, then according to the demand curve, if we talk about the degree of elasticity, so if it is elastic demand, then sellers bear most of the burden of the tax. And if supply curve is elastic, then the buyers will share most of the burden of the tax. And if it is inelastic demand, then buyers will bear most of the share. And if it is inelastic supply, then the sellers will bear most of the share. So this is the concept of the incidence of taxation, that is sharing the burden of taxation between buyers and sellers according to the elasticity of demand and elasticity of supply.